Hi, Crimies. I'm your host, MAB, and you're listening to the Coffee and Crime podcast. Before I begin, I have a confession. I recorded the entire almost hour long episode earlier, and I had coffee in my mug. However, when it came time to edit the podcast before I could upload it to YouTube, I realized that I recorded the entire thing on mute. So I promise I'm smart. I still have my coffee cup. However, it's no longer coffee in it. It's something a little bit stronger and it's wine. At least I'm transparent. To start off, this is a friendly warning. You might want to grab water, coffee, wine, and join me, beer, or whatever else you might feel like drinking. This is a longer one, and fair warning, we're going to be together for a minute. Welcome to episode 2. We'll be covering the story of Baylee Wylie. Even though these events take us back to 2015, it's important to retell them, not to pour salt in open wounds for the family and friends who I'm sure miss him tremendously, but just so the victim doesn't get forgotten. And hopefully, stories like this can spread awareness and we can either prevent a future one from happening or a similar story from repeating itself. Because Bailey lived in a few places like Moncton, Riverview, and Oromocto in New Brunswick, I'm going to give you a couple quick facts for each place just in case you're not familiar. In 2015, Moncton was the largest city in New Brunswick. It was also known to be the central location in the Maritimes, also known as the Hub City. As far as I know, to this day, it's still called the Hub City. Some popular attractions at the time included Magnetic Hill, which is still there, and it also has Magnetic Hill Zoo, which is quite popular, Champlain Mall, which is also still there, and loads of walking and hiking trails. Its population in 2011 was 69,074 residents, and that number grew slightly to 71,889 in 2016. To show the growth of this city even more in more recent times, as of July 1st, 2023, the population of Moncton, based on census statistics, was estimated at 178,971 residents. I lived in Moncton all my life before I moved to Nova Scotia 13 years ago. And let me tell you, it has changed tremendously. Now, Riverview is the largest town in New Brunswick. It's known for the important gateway to the Upper Bay of Fundy, which also includes the world-renowned Hopewell Rocks and Fundy National Park. Hopewell Rocks is absolutely beautiful. I do believe you have to time it with tide times. And Fundy National Park, I mean, if you haven't heard of it, you might live under a rock. Um, but it is so much fun. There's hiking trails, you can bike. There's so many things to do. In 2015, Riverview's population was approximately 19,128, while in 2021, it was said to be approximately 20,584. So not a huge jump, but it's still steadily increasing. And finally, Oromocto. It has its origin from the Aboriginal word well-a-muktuk. So essentially, the most common version of the meaning is described as deep river or good river for navigation by canoe. I thought that was really interesting. I did not know that until I did this research. And based on the 2016 census, the population in Oromocto was 9,223. And in 2021, it had approximately 9,045 residents. So a slight decline, but still pretty steady overall. Moncton obviously blows that out of the water. Little disclaimer before we get started. This story contains information that may affect some of you. trigger warnings for abuse, actions that are sexual in nature, and ending someone's life. So, viewer or listener discretion is advised. So, now that you have a few fun facts about each place, let's get into today's case. Bailey Wylie was born on April 6th, 1997, and at the time of his death, he was living in Riverview, New Brunswick. Bailey's obituary describes him as being survived by his mom, his aunt, Angela, and yes, you heard me correctly. I said his aunt, because to me, when people say aunt, it's an insect, and many more family members and friends. He was also said to have a very special friendship with his closest friends, which are not mentioned in this story, but they were Kelsey, Alexis, Cameron, and Jamie. The obituary goes on to describe Bailey as warm and kind-hearted, generous, and a very caring person. His engaging smile, and I know this is cliche, but if you look at any picture of Bailey or all the ones I could find, his smile is just so genuine and contagious. And again, I know it's cliche, but it radiated from him and he could literally brighten up any room. His sense of humor and his laugh and engaging nature were ever present. Based on what his mom and aunt said in an interview with the True North True Crime podcast, he was pretty responsible too, and he started delivering flyers and newspapers at the age of 14. I remember growing up, one of my best friend was a paper girl, and it was nice because she made her own money and she could buy things that maybe, her dad wouldn't have purchased for her. So it gave her, I guess, a level of independence that she wouldn't have had otherwise. He rarely ever left his mom or his grandparents' house without saying, "I love you" on his way out. I love that. He loved staying connected with people through social media, texts, and calls. That's, I guess, a pro and con of this day and age, because in my day, I don't want to date myself too much, but back in my day, we did not have cell phones. I was, I think, 21 before I got my first cell phone, and I believe my very first one was, I don't even know what brand, but it was a flip phone. Then I had a BlackBerry, and then I became cool and got the other newer Android phones. So I'm telling you this story because unfortunately, Bailey lost his life in the early morning hours of December 17th, 2015 at 96 Sumac Street in Moncton, New Brunswick. The events basically unfolded over a 24-hour period of drug use, sex, and the torturing of Bailey, which ultimately resulted in his death. What happened affected his aunt Angie so much that she said after her nephew's death, she needed medication basically just to get through the day. She was also hospitalized, and at the age of 37, she needed to move back home. That's really heartbreaking. Bailey went to Riverview Middle School, Riverview High, and the alternate education program in Moncton. So before I started researching this case, I had no idea what the alternate education program in Moncton was. And what I was able to find, it's basically a unique approach to learning outside of the traditional academic settings. It provides support for individuals who are seeking alternative paths to success. So I guess in a way, it just sounds like a fabulous option for students who are unable to follow school curriculum as it's presented in a regular school or class setting. So kudos for them for being able to create something like that. During the night of December 16th, a neighbor heard a commotion and they heard someone screaming, "No, I love you guys." She must have fell asleep, I'm assuming, because she woke up later to fire trucks and sirens outside, like later that night. Side note here, I do not want to blame anybody. I'm just genuinely questioning. If she heard somebody say that after a commotion, potentially, if police were called, this entire situation maybe could have been avoided. Now, I don't know. There's not a whole lot of anything about the neighbor who heard the commotion. So I don't know if maybe it didn't sound urgent or didn't give her the impression that it could be an emergency or it needed, law attention. I'll leave that there, but I just thought it was weird. Maybe she just thought it was no big deal, and it is what it is. Now, Bailey identified as bisexual. That doesn't matter to me one bit. Anyone who knows me knows that. However, it does come into play later on in the story, so I did want to mention it. And he was bullied a little bit, which is so wrong, regardless. But he was also fully accepted by his family and many of his friends. So I guess at least he had support where it meant something. There are more people involved in this story, so I'm going to try my best to share the information in a way that makes sense for everyone and is easy to understand. As my boss at my real job would say, and my friend Jen, she says it too, there's a lot to unpack, so let's open a suitcase at a time. In 2015, at 18 years old, Bailey was living with his girlfriend, Marissa Shepard. He was involved in sex work, and even though Tyler and Marissa were the ones to introduce him to the lifestyle, he did participate willingly. In the interview with his mom and aunt, they state that he did it mainly because he liked the money. And let's not forget, he was also 18. So even though they didn't necessarily agree with what he was doing, at 18, there's not a whole lot they could do, and he wasn't living at home. Bailey also had a best friend at the time, a girl named Bailey Spencer. Yes, Bailey. And Bailey Spencer was Tyler's girlfriend. She'll be mentioned later on in the story. Since I've introduced some new people in the story, let's talk about them quickly. So first we have Marissa Shepard. As mentioned earlier, she was involved in sex work. So when everyone was at the house, the boy would watch her son Cole while she would go escort. As per the interview, Cole and Bailey were really close, and it seems that he really stayed mainly because of Cole and maybe not so much just to be with Marissa. Marissa was the one renting the townhouse at 96 Sumac Street through NB Housing. I wasn't familiar with NB Housing, so I had to go Google it. And NB Housing is a shared funding initiative between the Government of Canada and the province of New Brunswick. So it helps residents who work part-time or work lower-paying jobs who are struggling to afford rent. This program helps with rent. So I guess it must subsidize a certain amount of rent that you're not able to cover. Marissa stated being introduced to illicit drugs at the young age of 12. This is sad. These included weed, meth, and MDMA. Later on, she was also being treated with antipsychotics, antidepressants, and methadone. Next in line, we have Tyler Noel, and there's no denying that Tyler had a rough life. His dad was incarcerated over 15 years from the time Tyler was young, so it's pretty safe to say that he never had his dad in his life, really, and possibly not very many role models that could teach him how to be a man. He was with his mom until he was around 13 years old, but then he was removed from that home and placed in social development housing. I wasn't sure what that was either, and when I Googled it quickly, I kind of got NB housing vibes, but there's no way he was removed from the home by himself at 13, because, hello, legality. So I feel like maybe it was like a group home setting. Tyler was in hot water with the law a few times, but because he was a juvenile, at the time, the records are sealed, so they're not accessible I can't get access to them. Neither can anybody else. So it's said that he was allegedly abused quite a bit during the time he lived with his mom. That's sad too. And then last but not least, we have Devin Morningstar. He lived in Moncton from the time he was born, and his parents divorced in his early teens, which is when his dad, Shane, moved out west. His parents' divorce really affected him, and this is what led to self harm, suicidal thoughts, which led to a diagnosis of depression. He became withdrawn and angry. And this is also when he started experimenting with soft drugs, then harder drugs like speed, acid, ecstasy. And this was all at the age of 15, so still quite young. At 16, he was diagnosed with anxiety. And there was also a tentative diagnosis of borderline schizophrenia. So, some pretty serious mental challenges. He ended up getting fired from his job at the time for showing up to work under the influence and for being just completely out of it. He lived with his mom in Moncton until one day she decided that she was packing up and moving to LA with a boyfriend. Devin didn't want to go, so he decided to stay behind in Moncton. He moved in an apartment, and by all accounts, he seemed to be doing well at the time of the murder. He was also working at Tim Hortons at the time. So he was planning on attending college, which is all positive things. And his social media really depicted how proud he was of his apartment and of all the things and the stuff he had. He was living there at the time with his girlfriend and 2 roommates. Articles describe that Bailey Wylie used to buy his weed from Devin, who he met through his best friend. Again, this is where she's mentioned, Bailey Spencer. And remember, Spencer was also Tyler Noel's girlfriend at the time. So to sum this up quickly, Marissa was Bailey's girlfriend. Tyler Noel and Bailey Spencer were dating, and he met Devin through his best friend, Bailey Spencer. I know this is a lot. I know, I get it. Just please hang in there. The interview with mom and aunt explained that approximately 4 days before the murder happened, Tyler and his girlfriend Bailey broke up. The way that all 4 people ended up at the Sumac Street address is that Bailey Spencer was dating Tyler Noel. He was at the Sumac Street townhouse, but she wasn't there. Her friend Devin was going through a recent breakup, so he came to hang out at the Sumac Street townhouse. And now this is how all 4 people involved are now under the same roof. Baylee Wylie, Marissa Shepard, Tyler Noel, and Devin Morningstar. Now, according to Devin's interview with police, he and Marissa had intercourse the night he got there. So she was dating Bailey, but had intercourse with Devin that night. I'm not here to judge. We all manage our relationships differently. Maybe that worked for them. All 4 of them has smoked a gram of crack. Personally, I've never smoked crack, but I can imagine what kind of effect that would have on a person. Things were calm for a bit, and everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. That same night, new evidence suggests that Bailey recorded himself engaging in oral sex with Tyler Noel, who was apparently highly intoxicated. A little while later, Devin wanted to see proof of what Bailey said happened with Tyler that night. He wanted to know if that was true. And this show of proof fueled an angry reaction from both Tyler and Devin. At this point, Bailey got upset and he was like, you know what? No, you guys need to leave. So when Tyler and Devin said they wouldn't leave, Bailey threatened to call the police. And according to court documents, Tyler had a large quantity of hard drugs that he brought to Marissa's that night. And he also had a .22 caliber rifle, but it had no ammo. After all this, Tyler and Devin decided they weren't going down, so they were going to frame Bailey for the drugs. And that's when the fight started. In Marissa's testimony, she says that Bailey kept reminding Devin that her and Bailey engaged in sex and also teasing Tyler with their sexual interaction of the night before. This made Devin and Tyler so angry that, according to Marissa, they started attacking Bailey with fists, so just punching him over and over again. Marissa also says that she left for escort twice that night, so she wasn't there to witness the entire incident. She then goes on to say that at some point a glass bong was thrown at Bailey, which caused a head wound. However, this also marked the first time that she left for work that night. Okay, cool. So not only do you not say anything, but you choose to leave to go do escort work when you know that there's mega tension at the house. So obviously, when she came back that night after her first little gig, the situation had gotten worse. Who would have thought? Devin and Tyler had secured Bailey to a chair. So they literally tied him to a chair. They had covered his face in plastic wrap, or like saran wrap. They did, however, make a little hole so that he could still breathe. And as if this wasn't terrifying enough, this was followed by Marissa and Tyler stabbing Bailey while he begged for them to stop. In Devin's testimony, he claims to have only stabbed Bailey 3 times. Again, he claims, no way to verify that. And it was only to prove his loyalty. But seriously, whether you stab somebody once, 3 times, or 50 times, you're just as guilty of that action, and it doesn't make you a better human being. At some point during the beating and stabbings, Bailey manages to reach the back door somehow, only to have Tyler start beating him with his rifle. This caused Bailey to fall onto a couch, which is when they started, viciously stabbing him continuously. While on the couch, this is so heartbreaking. Bailey said, "I love you, Missy. I can't believe you did this." Ugh, I can't even. In the recording, Devin described the last hours of Bailey's life in very graphic details. Devin estimates that Bailey was stabbed between 100 and 200 times, and he stated that Tyler did most of the stabbing. Obviously, if he only did 3 and Marissa only did 25. He admitted to stabbing Bailey about 3 times, as I mentioned earlier, and that Marissa stabbed him about 25 times in the chest area. And just when you think, wow, okay, this story's about to end, it's terrible. Nope. Then, after all this abuse was inflicted on Bailey and they determined that he was deceased, Marissa and Tyler decided that in hopes of destroying any and all evidence, they would douse his body in bleach, throw a mattress over him, and then they set the apartment on fire. Apparently, they believed no body, no crime. Wow. Okay. It's said that Bailey died shortly before 4 a.m., December 17th, 2015. The trio had a friend come pick them up around 4 a.m. They got to where Tyler lives, and that's when Tyler noticed Devin and Bailey Spencer deep in conversation. Tyler starts to get paranoid that Devin is divulging too much of the night's events to Bailey Spencer. And then he decides that he's going to consider killing Devin and Bailey as well. Surely this would prevent them from talking. This is when Marissa recalls telling Tyler that they are not killing anyone else tonight. So stopping here for a second, later on in the trial, I don't talk about it in this podcast, but later on in the trial, they mentioned that even though Marissa said that, it was just a way to say things. It wasn't meaningful. It didn't mean anything. However, if you were not implicated and you were not guilty, why would you say we are not killing anyone else tonight? Just food for thought. So I think the way we kind of got to know what happened for the most part, because there's no way of knowing other than somebody's testimony. And Devin's confession, which lasted about 3.5 hours, matched all the evidence at the scene with some added in between details. So that's how we got there. I also want to mention that the next day, when the family heard of a fire on the radio, they never put the pieces together because they did not know Marissa's address. So just take a second to put yourself in their shoes. And can you imagine not only hearing about this for the first time on the radio, not the police, not investigators, the radio, but then not even knowing that they're talking about your son or your nephew because you don't actually know the address where Marissa and Bailey lived. Just breaks my heart. I'm probably going to massacre his name, so I'm going to apologize in advance. But Dr. Nasimuddin, a specialist in anatomic pathology, said Bailey suffered 35 injuries just to the neck area. He had performed forensic autopsies for approximately 7 years at the time, and he said that any of some of the 18 injuries to Bailey's upper body could have ended his life. And I feel like after 7 years of autopsies, your testimony's pretty credible. 4 wounds penetrated the chest, puncturing the lung, which could have been fatal. He goes on to mention that 3 neck wounds, a collapsed lung, a punctured heart, and multiple injuries to the liver were all part of Bailey's suffering that night. Mom Amanda wept while the pathologist described what was done to her son, and at some point, understandably, she actually had to get up and leave the courtroom. He also mentioned that a fishing line was wrapped around Bailey's toe and that his legs were discolored, likely from the soot, the smoke, and the burns. He confirms that even though there were multiple blunt force trauma injuries to Bailey's head, none of them would have been considered fatal. And when Bailey's body was found, 15% of his body had suffered second and third degree burns. So just to back up for a second, I don't know the meaning of the fishing line that was wrapped around his toe or why that was even a thing. And when we go back to the blunt force trauma, stating that none of the head trauma caused his death, I can only hope that during this time he was unconscious, because I can't imagine somebody being tortured that way and being conscious and aware of what's happening. I can't wrap my mind around that. The autopsy photos confirm that Bailey suffered over 100 injuries to the neck and chest. I mean, this is crazy. You have to stab pretty forcefully to puncture multiple organs. And if we think of it for a second, if you're holding a knife, I mean, I've never stabbed anybody, but I'm assuming this is how you would hold a knife. And if you do a stabbing motion, after 10, 15, 20 stabs, it's not going to hurt like you've spent 3 hours in the gym, but you do feel it. So over 100 injuries, like that was fueled anger for sure. And not that it truly matters, but I do want to mention, like this doesn't matter because regardless, he lost his life over these senseless acts. But even though the injuries can be described, obviously it's impossible to know in which order they occurred. And it's also impossible to know which injury specifically caused his death that night. Now we're going to move on to the arrests. So on December 20th, 2015, Devin Morningstar was the first to be arrested and he was charged with first degree murder. An article states that Devin was called 3 times to testify during the testimony process in court, and each time he refused to take an oath or to speak at all. And I guess that's common for criminals from what I read. Devin was warned that refusal could lead to jail time. He didn't care, and that did not seem to affect him because it didn't change. The article also explains that Sergeant James McPherson testified about his interview with Devin and that the interview in question was recorded in December 2015, which is the same day that Devin was arrested for murder. Devin Morningstar was 19 at the time and was convicted of first-degree murder after a trial that lasted 4 weeks. So in some research, I got that the trial lasted 4 weeks. Other spots, it mentioned that the trial lasted 3 weeks, so I'll call it approximately 4 weeks. Devin's cuts and blood placed him at the scene, and the jury ended up deliberating for 2 days, and then they came back with the verdict of guilty of first-degree murder and arson. He was then sentenced to life in prison without the eligibility for parole until he had served 25 years for the charge of first-degree murder. For the arson conviction, he received a 3-year prison term to be served concurrently. So basically, it doesn't really exist because if you're serving 25 years minimum, that 3 years is definitely tucked in there somewhere. And I'm just going to play a clip from Global News. Please take a listen.
Parole after serving 25 years. Morningstar addressed the court prior to sentencing, saying he was sorry for his actions. In November 2016, Morningstar was found guilty of first-degree murder and arson in the death of 18-year-old Bailey Wylie, whose body was found in a burnt unit of a triplex on Sumac Street in Moncton just before Christmas in 2015. Wylie was stabbed multiple times before the triplex was set on fire.
After the murder, Tyler Noel went on the run, and there was a Canada-wide warrant that was issued in late December 2015. He was finally caught about 2 weeks later when the police received a complaint about 3 young men at a cottage or cabin in Elgin belonging to someone else. So basically, they just kind of broke in, and I'm guessing just to hide out, maybe they took a few objects, whatever. So shortly before 1 p.m. on January 9th, 2016, Tyler was located in a vehicle and he was charged with first-degree murder and arson. Tyler actually had about 34 prior convictions, and even though most of these happened when he was a juvenile, the judge still considered this when handing down his sentence. Following a deal with the Crown, Tyler Noel pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 16 years. Get this, though. Before the sentencing happened, Tyler tried to escape the St. John Correctional Center where he was being held, but luckily, he didn't get too far. Tyler also served a 3-year concurrent sentence for the other charge of arson with disregard to human life. Again, that'll be served concurrently, so it's almost like it doesn't exist. The judge took into consideration that his dad had been incarcerated most of his life and wasn't really present, and he had a drug-addicted mother who mistreated him when he was in her custody. The judge also took into consideration that he was diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder, or ODD, and attention deficit disorder, or ADD. He had to stop taking his prescription medication at around the age of 14 because this is when he could no longer afford to keep taking them. Now, we're still left with Marissa Shepherd. Some thought she was on the run, but others, including her dad, grandfather, and the father of her son, Cole, Stephen Nagel seemed to think that she could potentially be deceased because it was really not in the norm for her not to be in contact with anybody at all. Stephen Nagel even gave an interview stating that he had no idea where Marissa was and that he was deeply concerned for her safety. Fast forward to March 1st, 2016, Marissa is found at a Comfort Inn in Moncton with, guess who? Yep, you got it right, Stephen Nagel. There was also someone else with him named Crystal Toole, who was 32 at the time. So Stephen Nagel, who was Marissa's child's father, was dating Crystal Toole, which also meant that he violated a court order to stay away from her. Stephen was accused of helping Marissa by facilitating her escape, and he also felt the need to say that Marissa had all intentions of turning herself in prior to her arrest. Well, that's definitely a convenient statement. I'm curious to know if that would have actually happened. Here is the last clip from Global News.
It's very complex and deep, and it's very troublesome for everyone involved, like both families. Well, I've known Marissa for a very long time. We had a child at a very young age, me and her, and we were pretty well best friends since whatever. Lots of times we did not like each other, but what no one really understands about the whole situation is, like, thanks to social media, right? It's pretty much terrorized the lives of my family and Marissa's family. Like, I don't know, like, we're supposed to be in Canada, you're innocent until proven guilty, all that nonsense. Well, Marissa has been betrayed as a monster when no one even knows whether she's a victim or not. I mean, no one has seen from her, and in reality, I don't care if the cops are watching or not, I think Marissa would have reached out to me and asked for help, and since I've been back in Moncton, I haven't heard from her, and her family hasn't heard from her. She hasn't done any type of contact, which is, like, Marissa's an intelligent young lady, but, like, she doesn't like to be alone. You know what I mean? She would have reached out to the people she knows she can trust, and she hasn't reached out to me, so I fear the worst. You know what I mean? Her father, everyone fears the worst, and it really bothers me about the hate mail that my family and Marissa's family has been getting through social media.
How is your son doing?
My son doesn't understand, but my son is getting to the point where he's missing his mother for sure. You know what I mean? Because Marissa wasn't by any means the perfect mother, but she definitely loved her son, and he loved her.
Marissa was charged with first-degree murder and arson, and now it was her time to stand trial. When Marissa was in custody awaiting trial, there was a little incident that happened. In 2016, officers were sent to her jail cell because it was reported that she was banging her head against the wall and she was biting her arm. After managing to restrain her, she spit on one of the officers, and for this she got charged with assault, pleaded guilty, and she was slapped with a 4-month sentence. At her trial in 2018, she pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder and arson. She stated that she wasn't there when Bailey was murdered because she was out on work calls, so there was no way she could have witnessed all the events of that night. The jury didn't believe that, and they only took about 3 hours to deliberate. She was then found guilty of first-degree murder and arson without regard for human life. As if all of this wasn't bad enough, I was reading about the case and I thought, okay, not that the family ever forgets or moves on or gets past this, but I think at some point, once you have legal resolution, there's a certain level of not necessarily satisfaction. I don't really know what word to use, but you can start the process of grieving knowing that these people have been punished, sort of in a way, sometimes lightly, for what they've done. However, About a year after her conviction, Marissa's team puts in an appeal. Her lawyer used the defense that Devon's evidence and testimony should not have been presented in her case because technically it was or could have been considered hearsay. And I think I also forgot to mention earlier in the story. So, just in case you're wondering where her son was that night, because I don't think I touched on that or mentioned it earlier, he was actually with Marissa's mom as she came to pick him up earlier that day. So, Marissa admitted to being present at some point during the night, but she was too scared to try to stop the attacks on Bailey. I guess maybe she was too scared, but it doesn't necessarily, being scared doesn't necessarily align with stabbing someone in the chest about 25 times. So I'm not sure where she felt scared and why she couldn't say anything. All in all, the judge decided that Devon's statements were not reliable. However, he also stated that Marissa's behavior after the crime did not reflect the actions of an innocent person. She was seen on CCTV footage at a convenience store with the perpetrators later that day. On October 24th, 2019, Marissa wins her appeal, which also means that her conviction was overturned and a new trial would take place in August of 2021. And before they could iron out the details of what day and exactly when that new trial would take place, Marissa shocked everyone by pleading guilty to manslaughter and arson. This also means that she would skip the whole trial process and she would only need to show up in court for the sentencing part of it. So Marissa was sentenced to 12 years in jail, but this sentence also came with conditions. Condition number 1, she would be required to provide bodily fluid samples. Condition number 2, she would have no contact with the Wylie family at all. And condition number 3, a lifelong ban to possess firearms and ammunition. So for the charge of arson, she was handed a 3-year sentence. However, you got it, this was to be served concurrently, and she would be given credit for time served on top of that. Also, something I found really interesting when I was doing this research, because I had no idea that it was even a thing, while Marissa was incarcerated at the Joliet Capes, edit this. Also, something I found really interesting because I had no idea that it was even a thing before I did this research. While Marissa was incarcerated, she had a profile on inmatesconnect.com. And I had to go check it out because I'd never even heard of it, did not know it was a thing. So apparently an inmate can post a picture of themselves. They have the opportunity to describe their likes and dislikes, their looks, personality, what they're looking for, etc. And then there's a part at the bottom where they describe the crime they got charged with and they can talk about their sentence, etc. And this is so odd to me. You're a criminal, in this case specifically a murderer, and you can access inmate dating sites. Also, wouldn't it be kind of odd? Like, how do you plan this? Do you just plan the relationship to start when you get out of prison? Or, like, I don't know. How does that work? It's so weird. But hey, apparently it's something you can do at the Joliet Institute for Women in Quebec. Just FYI, if you ever end up there, you can date other inmates. Then, super quick side note. Yes, I know I'm introducing someone else, but I promise it'll be quick. Remember earlier When I said 3 men were in a cabin that didn't belong to them, and someone complained to the police, and that's how they kinda got figured out. Well, another teen named Zachary Holden was charged with being an accessory after the fact. He was also found guilty of possession of stolen property. It didn't specify if it was things they stole from that cabin, so I can't confirm that. He was also charged with dangerous driving because he was actually driving 147 kilometers an hour in an 80 zone and accessory to murder. He was sentenced to two 18-month concurrent sentences, a 12-month suspension from driving, firearm ban for 10 years, and he was also ordered to provide DNA samples. He received a credit of 1.5 days for each day served since January 9th, which only left him with approximately 130 days to serve. So the 3 men, just to recap, consisted of Tyler Noel, Zachary Holden, who we just talked about, and the third person was Bradley Bonnell. Bradley was sentenced to 9 months for helping Tyler flee police, and he was released in June 2016 for time served. So he finished his sentence. So finally, this brings us to today. Marissa is now out of prison and engaged. She was out and released in March 2024. Her reoffending rate was given a score of 17 on the criminal rate index, according to the parole board documents. So about 16% of female federal offenders will reoffend within 3 years with a score such as hers. She was out in 2024, March. We're now March 2025. So I guess we have a couple years to see how this will turn out. Maybe she won't reoffend. Maybe she will. Stay tuned. Tyler Noel and Devin Morningstar are still serving their sentences for the murder of Bailey Wylie. I guess I have some questions and I'm interested in knowing your thoughts. So please flood the comment section with what you think. How can someone who contributed in the death of another human being like Marissa did only serve a total of 8 years in prison? Bailey Wylie suffered for over 6 hours of being tortured, resulting in him losing his life. And you do 8 years behind bars? Doesn't sit well with me. I would also like to know your thoughts about whether you think our justice system is really built for the victims or the criminals. I know in the eyes of the law, you are innocent until proven guilty. However, once you're guilty, do the sentences that are imposed really fit the crime? Like, I guess I'm curious to know what you think about it. So, quick side note here. I've been in TikTok jail, and I don't know what I can and can't say on YouTube. So, if anything gets flagged, I'm sure I'll experience YouTube jail, which the background is quite fitting of that. To wrap it up, I really want to thank you, especially if you made it to the end of Bailey's story. It's so heart-wrenching, and like I said at the start of the episode, our brains are sort of wired to release older information, if you will, to replace it with new information. And this is part of the reason why I'm doing these podcasts. Number one, I hope I really do them justice. I don't want to insult anybody or make anybody angry. It's not the point of these podcasts. I just really want to spread awareness. And even though, again, like I said earlier, even though this happened 10 years ago, for the families, it's probably as fresh as if it happened last week. So I just don't want them to be forgotten. Bailey seemed to be a really beautiful soul, and I think he just deserves to be mentioned and remembered. So I'll pop all the pertinent information in the show notes or description, as I always do. And I want to thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with me once again. Again, free to you, helps me out and helps me grow my channel. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And remember my corny phrase, crime is a waste of time. So until next time, bye, crimies.